Hello, I'm Bob Wilson. I'm a counselor at Corizon Family and Community Services. This is the first of three brief presentations on the challenges of returning to work during the conditions of the pandemic. These three short presentations will cover three topics. First of all, recognizing the possible effects of the pandemic on all of us. Second, discussing some of the potential challenges in transitioning back to work. And finally, some tips for work-life balance in these challenging times. In this, the first presentation, we'll be looking for a few moments at the effects that the pandemic might be having on all of us. Most of us have not experienced anything quite like this in our lifetime. We're dealing with an unseen threat, and we're never quite sure when or where it might strike. And that has big implications for our coping. We do have an inbuilt system to deal with challenges in our lives, but it wasn't quite built for what we're presently experiencing. Our inbuilt system to deal with threats and challenges is called the stress response. It's activated when an immediate and present threat is detected and immediate dramatic action is needed to deal with it. Classically, we see this in the three F's: fight, flight, or freeze. Usually we don't consciously choose which one we use. It's automatic and outside of our conscious control. That's why we sometimes feel surprised or ambushed by our own reactions. The stress response is built to respond to an immediate and present threat, deal with that threat, and then allow us to return to a rest state. For example, think of the nature shows on TV where the lion is chasing the gazelle. The chase does not last long. Either the gazelle escapes or the gazelle does not. But in either case, the crisis is brief. But working in the midst of a pandemic does not follow these rules. In the case of the pandemic, the threat is invisible. We can't see it, although we see indicators of the threat all around us. News stories, new protocols and policies, news of outbreaks, etc. Since it's not visible, we tend to be activated for the threat, but with no signal that the threat has been dealt with. So there's no signal saying it's okay to come back to a rest state. The result is staying in some middle degree of fight or flight or freeze on an ongoing basis. We're not biologically built to sustain that for very long, and so it grinds us down in one way or another. In addition, the pandemic has altered our lifestyles and our routines of life in a variety of ways, leaving us disoriented. Think of how, for example, the children were home from school and had to take their lessons online, and now their activities might be restricted during the summer. We may be spending a lot more time with spouses or partners. We may be working from home, trying to deal with communication technologies, trying to set work-home boundaries, and so on. When the stress response doesn't know whether to turn on or off, we get chronic ongoing stress, and this can grind different people down in a variety of ways: physically, mentally, emotionally, socially, spiritually, and so on. One of the most common responses of chronic stress is anxiety. It's important to know the difference between healthy fear and unhealthy anxiety. Healthy fear is when we fear an actual present threat. That fear can keep us alive. On the other hand, unhealthy anxiety is when we stew in our heads with a bunch of speculative what ifs and playing out worst case scenarios. And the problem is that we emotionally react as though these speculations and mere thoughts are actually happening. In the complicated circumstances of the pandemic, we're trying to cope with a complicated mix of the two, both realistic and healthy fear and unrealistic and unhealthy anxiety, because there are both realistic concerns that we have to deal with and our own minds rushing off to worst case scenarios and what ifs. And so the mind has to keep up an ongoing mental sorting process between the two, which taxes our energy. Small wonder then that in addition to feelings of anxiety, there may also be feelings of anger, frustration, or irritability at so many changes and so many things that are unexpected. In addition to feelings of stress and anxiety and frustration, chances are we're also dealing with some feelings of grief, whether they're conscious or not. Grief is a normal and healthy response to loss, and yet it can take a great deal of energy. For example, we may be experiencing grief concerning the loss of face-to-face interactions with friends, family, colleagues, and clients, loss of our routines and activities, loss of access to our workplaces, loss of hope for a fast resolution to the pandemic, loss of a transition phase to different work protocols, given that they are developing very quickly, and in some cases, more seriously, loss of employment, loss of health, or even loss of people through death. In addition, we may be experiencing some compassion fatigue. In other words, our energy to be caring and present to others is starting to wane. Lastly, I'd like to take a look at a few of the signs that the stress might really be getting to us. In other words, that we might be running on empty. This might be an invitation to enhanced self-care or even to reach out for some support. For example, chronic exhaustion and physical ailments that have no other medical explanation, like back pain, headaches, body aches, and so on. Chronic feelings of depression or anxiety or fatigue or irritability, or even signs of PTSD. Emotional states and moods often that have no content to them. In other words, I feel really anxious, but I'm not sure what I'm anxious about. Inability to listen or deliberate avoidance, avoiding people, calls, texts, or even avoiding the things we used to enjoy. Zoning out. I have no idea what you just said in the last couple of minutes or what I just read in the last several minutes. Feeling that it's hard to empathize, feeling like my feelings are shut down. If I'd let myself feel this, I think to myself, I'd fall apart. So I either shut down or I overstimulate myself all the time. A sense of hyper-responsibility. I can't take a break. What would they do without me? Or feeling I only have self-esteem and self-worth if I never stop being productive. Feelings of lost creativity. Wanting to just leave things the same. Change becomes terrifying. An exaggerated sense of persecution. Now, if someone is mistreated in a workplace, that is, of course, a serious thing. But that's not what I'm talking about here. What I mean here is when every simple little request or interruption becomes a big deal. Everyone's always picking on me. Turning to addictions to instantly escape. When uncertainty becomes unbearable. Someone just give me the answers, now, whether they make sense or not. And finally, remember that the effects that we may be experiencing from the pandemic may continue on for a while after the pandemic conditions ease. So be watchful for your own self-care and for your need for support. These have been a few thoughts on recognizing the possible or potential effects of the pandemic on all of us. We present these effects not to cause alarm, but as an invitation to your own self-care, the care of your loved ones, and for reaching out for support if you feel the need. The next brief presentation will be a discussion of some of the potential challenges in transitioning back to work. Be good to yourselves.